Hi everyone, thanks for joining us today. Hopefully you can hear me. My name is Jennifer Cook. I'm the Small Acreage Management Coordinator for the Front Range in Colorado. And our webinar today is just made available by this partnership with Natural Resources Conservation Service and Colorado State University. And we're also happy to be partnering with Emily Glunk and Montana State University today. Emily is an extension forage specialist and assistant professor at Montana State University, and she'll be talking with us today about non-structural carbohydrates in horses and the role of forages. Real quick before we get started, looks like we only have a few participants, but just to let you know, you can use the chat box in the bottom left-hand corner of your screen to communicate with Emily. If you have questions or comments during the presentation, you can communicate with Emily in that way. Our presentation is being recorded and will be posted and available on the Small Acreage Management website probably later on today or tomorrow. With that, I will turn things over to Emily.
Great. Thanks, Jennifer. So I'll wait for this to get loaded. Okay, so just to give you a little bit of background about myself, I'm currently the Extension Forage Specialist here at Montana State University. But both of my graduate degrees, my master's and my PhD, actually focused more on equine nutrition and the role that forages play in animal nutrition, but specifically in horses. So to get started, Jennifer asked me to talk about this. This was a presentation that I did at one of our forage meetings that we had in fall of last year. And we just wanted to kind of talk a little bit about, what are non-structural carbohydrates and why are they so important in the horse world? Why is that kind of a buzzword that a lot of people are talking about? And how can we manage that when it comes to forages? And how can we use our knowledge of forages to help decrease potential problems that we may see in our horses? So first, why are they important? Well, we know NSCs, or non-structural carbohydrates, have roles in a lot of different diseases that we see present in our horses. I'm sure everyone is familiar with Laminitis. It's one of the most common diseases or issues that we see occurring in our horses. Insulin resistance is a new one that has gotten more and more attention in recent years. And a lot of times with this whole list of diseases, they're interrelated. We see that horses that have one are at an increased risk or already have one of these other things. Cushing's is another one that we're seeing more and more older horses come down with. Again, non-structural carbohydrates are important in that as well. The next one, equine metabolic syndrome, this is a fairly new, the term was coined in the last 10 years. And basically what this is a conglomeration of a couple different things occurring in the horse. So mainly most of these horses that have EMS typically are obese or overweight. They're prone or have had laminitis in their history. When tested, they have insulin resistance, and they either have Cushing's or are at a higher risk for Cushing's. Colic is another one that I'm sure you all are familiar with. A lot of times it gets overlooked, and especially why non-structural carbohydrates, why is that important in colic? And I'm going to talk about that here in a little bit. Other ones that are maybe less familiar, we don't talk about them as much, polysaccharide storage myopathy, or PSSM, which is basically a problem with the horse's processing of storing glucose and glycogen, where they need to have lower glucose intakes, and glucose is a result of non-structural carbohydrate intake. Osteochondrosis, so problems in bone growth and formation in growing animals, that can be implicated with non-structural carbohydrates as well, mainly because of increased weight gain, but we're not going to talk about that a whole lot today. So like I said, equine metabolic syndrome, again, it's that conglomeration of a couple different diseases that we see present in horses. Typically, it's characterized by high cortisol levels. And cortisol, as you may have come across, is known as the stress hormone. Okay? And cortisol is regenerated, as we see, from those adipose tissues, so from those fat tissues in obese horses. So the more obese your horse is, the more cortisol is going to be produced. So typically your horse is functioning not necessarily at a higher stress level, but physiologically it has more cortisol, more of that stress hormone present. And then with that increased cortisol circulating through that horse, we see decrease in the number of insulin receptors. This decrease in insulin receptors decreases that glucose's ability to enter the cell. And again, glucose is produced from the breakdown of that non-structural carbohydrates. So, if our horses have an elevated non-structural carbohydrate intake, they're going to have an elevated glucose level once that is broken down. And if we don't have enough insulin receptors to be able to metabolize that glucose, that's going to create an issue. So that blood glucose remains high. The liver is going to try to suck up as much of that as it can, converts it to fat. That then in turn increases fat, increases adipose, increases cortisol. And so it's this vicious cycle that these horses can get into. And non-structural carbohydrates really are a major problem when we talk about this particular disease. Going a little quick there. So again, this one I'm sure you're familiar with. If anybody has seen a horse that's gone through laminitis, this is the classic laminitis stance that we see in this upper right-hand corner. And it's one of the most common diseases that we're going to see. Next to colic, we have a lot of horses that come down with this. And when we talk about nutrition and how nutrition is related to laminitis, it really centers around that non-structural carbohydrate, that NSC intake. And what happens, and this is similar to what happens in colic, but it doesn't get as far. But what happens is that horse consumes a large amount of non-structural carbohydrates. This can be in the form of grain, oats or corn, which is typically higher in that digestible carbohydrates, those non-structural carbohydrates. It can also happen on spring pasture. So rapidly growing forages that we see coming out right about now, those smaller grasses, they're going to have higher levels of non-structural carbohydrate. It's going to be a lot more accessible to these animals. And us in the Intermountain West, we're at an even increased risk for having higher non-structural carbohydrates than other places in the U.S. because we're typically growing our forages at higher elevations and cooler temperatures. So that again leads to that higher non-structural carbohydrate. So what happens is these horses, they consume a large amount. Normally, what they try to do, what the body tries to do, is absorb those non-structural carbohydrates in the small intestine. So before it gets to that large intestine, before it gets that site of fermentation. But when they eat too much, when they consume too much, we have what's called non-structural carbohydrate overload. So a lot of those non-structural carbohydrates reach that hindgut. And this causes a disruption in the microbes that live in that hindgut. Okay, because most of the microbes, when a horse is on a primarily forage-based diet, they're microbes that like to eat grass, that like to eat the cellulose and the hemicellulose, okay, those cell wall carbohydrates. There's a small amount of microbes back there that like these non-structural carbohydrates. When we introduce a lot of these NSCs, that small portion or that small population of microbes proliferates and increases dramatically and kind of pushes out those cellulose-loving microbes. These NSC, the non-structural carbohydrate-loving microbes, produce something called lactic acid. And just like the name implies, acid decreases that hindgut pH. And so it can actually compromise the walls, the integrity of that hindgut, and some of their enterotoxins, some of their products, can actually get into the horse's blood. And that is what will travel down into the bloodstream and into that hoof wall and cause that dissociation of the coffin bone from that hoof wall. And that's where we see those horses exhibiting that laminitic stance. So if you look at this picture that's on our lower right hand, we can see exactly what's happening when that dissociation occurs. So you can see that coffin bone is kind of outlined in pink there. Normally that should be parallel to that hoof wall. But because of these enterotoxins, because of these processes that are occurring, we see that dissociation, that breakdown of that hoof wall. That coffin bone actually rotates and it starts to push through the sole of that hoof. Now we have one question here. Did you say that hay grasses from higher mountain areas are typically higher in NSC? Yes, unfortunately. With these higher elevation and cooler temperatures, it's a perfect growing environment for elevated non-structural carbohydrates. So just to kind of give you a frame of reference, I worked in North Carolina for my master's degree, and we were doing some work looking at non-structural carbohydrates and pastures. We had a difficult time getting high enough non-structural carbohydrates. We weren't grazing them. We wanted to just test them. We had a really hard time getting any pasture grass to be above this elevated threshold level that we look for, and we'll talk about that in a little bit. When we come out here to Colorado, to Montana, we see it's not unusual for pasture grasses in the spring to have non-structural carbohydrate levels that are 30% and above. That's really, really high. Okay, we were trying to get above 12% in the south, in North Carolina. We were lucky when we got 14%. Okay, so it can be double the amounts. So yes, we're kind of set up to have that perfect storm of having a lot of really great grass, but grass that's high in non-structural carbohydrates. And we're going to talk about ways that we can limit how much horses are eating when they're out at pasture in the spring. It's not a death sentence. It does not mean that you cannot turn your horses out on spring pasture. There's just maybe some precautions that you want to take when you are turning them out. So laminitis, as I have at the bottom here, is also linked to insulin resistance. That's what IR stands for. And again, that has to do with that rapid intake of non-structural carbohydrates and the horse being unable to metabolize and digest all of that glucose that is produced from the non-structural carbohydrates. So these are all interrelated diseases that we see kind of centering around this non-structural carbohydrate content of forages or of grains. So with insulin resistance, typically it's strongly linked with that increased risk of obesity. So if you have a horse out there that has a really crusty neck, or you see fat deposits over the rump, or even over the ribs and shoulders, that horse is going to have an increased risk for insulin resistance. And again, basically all that's happening is that there's a malfunction with how that horse is able to respond to glucose. It can be due to the fact that it just doesn't have enough insulin receptors. It can be that the receptors aren't working properly. It can be that the receptors are there, but then once those receptors are trying to get the glucose to be able to metabolize it out of the bloodstream, something is happening with that pathway and it's not able to metabolize it correctly. Okay, and then this is going to lead to the pancreas having to work harder. So we see downstream effects of having some of these issues. And again, that's where managing that non-structural carbohydrate is going to be really important so that we can better help the overall health of our horses. So what can an increased likelihood of non-structural carbohydrate, what does that lead to, or what can cause it? Diet, number one. Okay, by far, one of the things that I see quite a bit is we have a lot of people that love to feed their horses grain. Okay, horses obviously love grain. It makes them happy. They'll come trotting over to you from out in the pasture because they want to eat it. Not every horse needs to have that supplemental grain in its diet. That's why I always say when you're trying to determine how much to feed your horse, always start with the forages. Know what you're feeding there. So whether it's on pasture, you can go and test your pasture. And I'm sure Jennifer has talked to you about this before as well. You know, you can test it for energy, protein, mineral levels. See where it's meeting and maybe where it's deficient for that horse. Same thing can be done with the hay. If you find that whatever you're feeding, whether it be hay or whether it be pasture, is not meeting your horse's requirements, and this can happen, you know, if you have a lactating mare or a horse that's working really hard, that's when you would want to add some some grain into the diet. Okay, but make sure first to check to see whether forages can meet the requirements or not. Also, what we see, which is kind of tied to diet, is weight. Okay, and again, as I mentioned in the first couple of slides, obesity is linked to most of these diseases. It is a risk factor for most of these diseases, as well as a problem in itself. And production level can really be tied into this as well. So when we add diet and production level, that's really going to tell us where our horse is going to end up on that weight scale. One of the biggest problems that we have is that a lot of people think their horses are working harder than they actually are. And we have thresholds. We can measure heartbeats per minute. We can measure it in, you know, how many hours of trotting you're doing a week versus cantering a week versus walking. That can really fine-tune exactly what production level you're at. Because if you think your horse is at a hard level of work, but it's really only a moderate, and you're feeding to that elevated level of work, that's where you're going to see the horse put weight on. And always monitor your horse's weight, whether you're using weight tape, whether you have access to a scale, body condition scoring. This is really going to help to tell you how your ration, how what you're feeding that animal is doing for it and how it's meeting its requirements. Age is another thing that can be linked with a lot of these non-structural carbohydrate issues. As horses get older, we typically see more issues occurring. And you can see that with things like Cushing's, which typically shows up in more geriatric horses. Even insulin resistance is going to happen a lot of times when horses are a little bit older. Now, something like laminitis, that can occur at any time. Okay, so not always tied there, but we see that as that horse ages, typically the risk factor increases. Breed is another thing. I'm sure everyone has seen those porky little ponies or quarter horses out there. Okay, there are some breeds that are at higher risk levels for these issues as well. And then, of course, disease history. And this is something you can work with your veterinarian on. If the horse is prone to laminitis, and some are, this is going to increase its chances for having other issues as well. And then the final thing that I'll mention, because this is very important, quick changes in diet. Okay, so you can adjust any horse. So if we have this really high non-structural carbohydrate pasture, okay, we can acclimate our horses to it. Some pastures are going to be higher than we would really want to have our horses on. Again, we need to test for that. But if you slowly acclimate your horses to any changes in diet, that is going to set them up better to not have these disease issues. So whether you're switching from different types of hay, whether you're switching them onto spring pasture, or if you're adding some grain into their diet, do it slowly. What we recommend in the spring, because now is a perfect time to talk about this, we typically want to be putting them onto pasture in 15-minute increments. So what that means is once your pasture gets about 6-8 inches tall and it's ready for horses to be grazing on it, then you want to start off day one only allowing your horses to go out for 15 minutes. Now, in my experience with my horses, that usually means I do not take the lead rope off or else I'm not going to catch them for another 30 minutes. But allow them to graze for 15 minutes on day one. Day 2, 30 minutes. Day 3, 45 minutes. So on and so forth, till you get to about 4 hours. Once you reach 4 hours, then typically it has had enough acclimation. It is set up that you can turn it out for a 24-hour period. Now again, you still want to be checking your pastures. You still want to evaluate how high those non-structural carbohydrate levels are before you determine if it's safe or not. Okay? Whenever you're adding grain, do that slowly as well. Now, if you're adding a significant amount of grain to that horse's diet, you probably want to be looking at about a 10-day to 2-week period that you're changing that horse or adding that into that horse's diet. Because if we have too rapid of a change, whether it's grain, whether it's a different type of forage, that's going to mess up those microbes in the hindgut, and that can cause issues like colic or even laminitis when we're talking about non-structural carbohydrates. So what are the important numbers to know? What should you be looking for? Well, number one, when we're out there testing our pastures, when we're looking at our rations, when we're looking at hays, the smaller the better for any horse that is at risk for having any of these issues. Typically, 12% is kind of that upper threshold that we look at for any horse that has had laminitis, that has insulin resistance, or if they have severe equine metabolic syndrome, that EMS, we want to have a maximum of 10%. Okay, but if I have anybody sending me any sort of hay analysis that tells me their horses have had laminitis in the past, I want to know if it's 12% or less. That's the golden standard. For horses, if the only issue they have that you know of is that polysaccharide storage myopathy, then we can have a little bit more leeway. We're about 15%, okay? But again, if it has PSSM with something else, if it's colicked a lot in the past, if it's had laminitis, stick to that 12%. Another way to look at it, if you're trying to avoid any sort of acute issues, such as colic that happens, from that quick changeover in grain or adding too much spring pasture, you want to stay under 3 grams per kilogram intake. So all you need to do is know how much your horse weighs And then you need to know what is the starch content or what is the non-structural carbohydrate content of what you're feeding them. To be extra safe, stay closer to 2 grams per kilogram of body weight or below. And always, 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 I can't say this enough, avoid rapid changes. Now, young horses are a little bit different. Okay, when we're talking about horses that are under 1 year, under 2 years even, although not so much, young horses typically don't have that hindgut developed as much. So they can consume actually a little bit more grain, a little bit higher non-structural carbohydrate, only because that hindgut hasn't developed as much. So we can feed them larger portions of grain compared to hay, and they should be just fine. But again, even with the young horses, you still want to avoid rapid changes, and you still want to have forages be the basis of any ration of a horse that has that ability to consume those forages, okay? Not for those young ones that are still nursing off of their mothers, but for horses that are already weaned, that are already out in the pasture, forages should make up the balance of that. They're probably going to need grain just because they typically have higher requirements, but that should still be okay. They typically, for anything that's under 1 year old, they can actually have about, a 40% forages to 60% grain, and they can function properly. When we look at older horses, okay, that are at maintenance, we want to see the exact opposite and even higher, okay? At maximum, grains should make up no more than 40% of your horse's ration. So what numbers do we use to get our desired numbers? A lot of times when you send your hay, you send your forage off for analysis, it comes back not as non-structural carbohydrate. Depends on where you send it, but it doesn't always come back as non-structural carbohydrates. What they will give you, though, are 2 numbers, which are called water-soluble carbohydrates, WSC, and they'll give you starch, okay? To get non-structural carbohydrate, all you do is add those 2 numbers together, and that'll give you your total non-structural carbohydrates. Some places will try to use what's called ethanol-soluble carbohydrates instead of water-soluble carbohydrates. I think, and others agree, that this actually underestimates then the actual non-structural carbohydrate content of that feed, because it leaves out an important part called fructans. So I always recommend using that water-soluble carbohydrate plus starch. And for those of us that join late, if you guys have any questions at all, please use that chat box on the side and I'll try to catch them as they come. So where can you get your forages tested? Well, number one, I always recommend contact the forage specialist for your state or myself. Contact Jennifer, contact your county agent or NRCS. They all have people there that can help you to figure out exactly how you should get your forages tested. They even usually have resources available like hay probes or even squares or shears that can help you to collect those samples. Not all labs are going to test for non-structural carbohydrates. The 4 that do is Equine Analytical. That's probably the one that I see the most analyses through. University of Georgia does as well. West Virginia University and Cumberland Valley Analytical, they both do. Cumberland, I just had some analyses done through them this spring, and they do the water-soluble carbohydrates, I believe, as well, on top of that ethanol-soluble carbohydrate and starch. But West Virginia, to my knowledge right now, only does that ethanol-soluble carbohydrate plus starch, so it's going to have a slightly lower number than the true non-structural carbohydrates. Okay, so any questions? Again, you can raise your hand. There is a tool at the top of your screen for that. I'm going to move into how we can start to decrease or think about decreasing non-structural carbohydrate in our horses. So number one, the most obvious, is feed low non-structural carbohydrate forages. Not always possible, but there are some things that you can do to help to kind of make sure that you're buying the lowest non-structural carbohydrates as possible. Number one, more mature forages. Okay, so forages, hay, or grazing that's being harvested later into maturity when seed heads are present. That typically is going to have lower non-structural carbohydrates than more vegetative or early growth forages. So if you're buying hay and you're trying to feed low non-structural carbohydrates, look for seed heads in that hay. That tells you that those forages were harvested a little bit later. Avoiding grain, because grain just naturally has higher non-structural carbohydrates. That's why we're feeding it a lot of times, because it's a more dense energy form compared to those forages. There's a new well, not new, I shouldn't say that. It's becoming more popular in our region of the United States. It's a warm season annual grass called teff. And teff is typically lower in digestibility and it's lower in non-structural carbohydrates. So this is perfect for those overweight horses or horses that have issues with ingesting non-structural carbohydrates, that have a history of laminitis or colic frequently. This is another thing to be looking for. A question here, does the cutting affect non-structural carbohydrates, meaning first, second, or third cutting? Cutting, not so much. But what we do see related with the cutting is the fact that, say in spring on that first cutting, a lot of times because the fields are so wet, because we're getting a lot of moisture, that is harvested typically a little bit later. So because of that, because it's harvested later, we typically have more mature forages, we might have lower non-structural carbohydrates. Now, to make that more complicated, we see with the non-structural carbohydrates a variation throughout the year. So with spring and with fall, typically we're going to have higher non-structural carbohydrates. We also see differences from morning to evening. Non-structural carbohydrates, this is important for grazing, non-structural carbohydrates peak in the afternoon around 3 or 4, and they're lowest in the morning around 2 to 3. So if you have a horse that you're trying to graze and you don't want it to have access to a large amount of non-structural carbohydrates, turn it out overnight. Okay, if you can do it later, say 8 or 9 after those carbohydrates have gone down, that's going to help significantly. But as far as cutting, not necessarily. If, though, you were trying to go for the lowest, I would probably try to go something that was cut in midsummer, where we're kind of in between that spring and fall elevated non-structural carbohydrate, if that helps at all. One common misconception that I hear all the time is that a lot of people think alfalfa is typically higher in non-structural carbohydrates than grasses. And I'm here to say that that is not true. When you test alfalfa that is cut at the same maturity as, say, timothy or orchard grass or fescue, a lot of times that alfalfa is going to have lower non-structural carbohydrate levels than that grass. Okay, so for a horse that has laminitis, that's prone to laminitis, or has equine metabolic syndrome, a lot of times I recommend feeding a little bit of alfalfa, a mixed forage for those horses. If they don't have issues with obesity or being overweight, you can feed 100% alfalfa. But alfalfa is a little bit more digestible, has a little bit more calories, so if your horse has any weight issues, you don't want to feed pure alfalfa for that reason. That's why a mixed grass is going to really help with that. Mixed alfalfa grass will help to decrease the non-structural carbohydrates from that alfalfa inclusion, and it will help to decrease the overall caloric intake because of that grass inclusion. And then we talked a little bit already about pasture, like I said, turning out when it's lower in non-structural carbohydrates, so late in the evening, early in the morning is going to be much better than it during the afternoon. Okay. And then again, summer pasture is typically going to have lower non-structural carbohydrates than that spring or that fall. So with us, a lot of our pasture is going to be cool season perennial grasses. So you can think of cool season grasses are rapidly growing in spring and fall. Whenever those grasses are rapidly growing, that's typically when we're going to see that high non-structural carbohydrates. Another way that we can help to decrease non-structural carbohydrates is by increasing time of consumption. If you remember from earlier in the presentation, one of the major things that we talked about was that it's that rapid ingestion of that non-structural carbohydrate or of that glucose that's causing the glucose spike, that's causing that insulin spike, that's causing a lot of these issues. So if we can spread out how long it takes for that horse to consume these things, these foods, whether it be forages or grains, that typically will decrease that glucose spike, will also decrease that insulin spike. And then, of course, acclimation, which we talked about, and I have a slide here at the end as well. So I want to show you a couple videos, and hopefully these work. This was one of my projects that I worked on during my PhD at the University of Minnesota. And what we wanted to do is we wanted to look at these slow feed hay nets. Okay, no one has done any research on this. They claimed that they increased consumption time, but we didn't know how much. So what we did is we had one treatment where horses were fed hay just on the ground. That was our control. Then we had another treatment, which is this first picture here, where we just went and bought one of the regular hay nets with the large openings that you can get at any commercial feed supply store. Then we went and we bought two other sizes. We went through a company called Cinch Chicks, and I think they've changed their name since then. But we got their medium hole net, which had openings of about 1 3/4 inches, and then their small net, which had openings of about 1 1/4 inches. And we wanted to see what was the effects of these slow feed hay nets. Did it increase that time to consumption? Did it alter horses' behavior at all? So this first video here is a horse that's eating out of that commercially available net. And I don't think it's going to work. Oh no. All right, I guess we won't be able to see these videos. But basically what this one shows is that the horse is able to access that hay no problem. It can stick its entire muzzle in there, can grab a giant bite, not inhibited whatsoever. And we have another question here. Does soaking hay in water help lower non-structural carbohydrates? Yes, it does. So those non-structural carbohydrates are water soluble. So soaking for about 20 to 30 minutes can help to lower those carbohydrates. The issue that we have is that it can also lower some of the vitamin and mineral components as well. So you just want to be mindful of that. But that is a great way to help lower your horse's intake. Absolutely. So I'm sorry that these videos aren't working. They were actually pretty funny. I enjoy showing these. This is our medium net with one of our horses that had a really great system of figuring it out. What she would do is she would actually bite the net and shake it, as you can kind of see from this picture, and a bunch of the stems and leaves would fall to the floor, and then she would eat them off the floor because she didn't feel like nibbling through that hay net. But it was really interesting to watch with this hay net and the small net. The horses were not able to dig their muzzles into those hay nets. They had to basically use their lips to kind of pull out pieces, and it made it a little bit harder for them to get those big bites. And this last video was supposed to show you another one of our horses on the smallest opening net. And again, you can see very few stems stick out. They really have to use their muzzle, really have to use their lips, which you can kind of see in this picture again, to pull out those the pieces of hay. If I was able to show this video, it's really interesting because it kind of perfectly showed one of the major questions that we get asked. So after a couple seconds of this horse trying to get the hay, he all of a sudden just kind of attacks it and bites it really hard. Okay. What we found was that typically it took horses about 4 feedings. They were pretty frustrated, especially if we just turned them onto that small net right away. They got very frustrated immediately, but then they kind of acclimated to it. And after that 4th feeding, they were eating from it just fine. They all had different methods of how they were eating from it. Like I said, whether it was shaking it out and eating it off the floor, or whether they were just kind of picking it through. But it was really interesting to see how it affected the horse's behavior. And then even more interesting was when we looked at the data. So originally when we designed this project, we only were allowing them 4 hours to eat about 1% of their body weight. So they were eating at 2% of their body weight daily. Okay, so we gave them 4 hours. On the x-axis of this graph, we have what's C, or the control, so hay fed on the ground. That LN was that commercially available net. MN was the medium net, again the 1 3/4 inch openings, and SN was that small net, the 1 1/4 inch openings. What we found was that horses on the control and the large net, number one, were not able to finish in those were able to finish in those 4 hours, but they had a little bit of waste. That was at 5% there. The horses that were on the medium net and the small net did not get to finish. Okay, you can see the medium net, they were typically able to eat about 89% in 4 hours. On the small net, only about 72%. Okay, major differences there. When we look at how much they consumed in kilograms of dry matter per hour, so this is the rate of hay consumption, horses on the control were able to eat about 1.5 kilograms per hour. Look at that small net, only 0.9 kilograms of dry matter per hour. Okay, so really slowing them down significantly, and we see almost a linear decrease, which was really interesting, from that control all the way down to that small net. When we look at the total time to consumption, so how much did it take these horses to eat one meal? And we did the 2-meal system because that's what most people are doing in the US. They're feeding their horses in the morning and the afternoon. We wanted to mimic that as closely as possible. So what we found was that on the control, it only took horses a little over 3 hours to eat that entire meal. On the large net, only about 3.4, 3.5. Like I said, on the medium net and the small net, horses typically didn't have the ability to finish. So we said, okay, if horses can't finish from the medium net and small net in 4 hours, how long does it actually take them to finish? So we did a follow-up study with that, where we only used the medium net and the small net. We used the same horses, same hay. We fed them. We only recorded the time it took them to eat in the morning, 1 feeding a day. And we wanted to see how long did it drag it out? How much longer did it take them? It took those horses on the medium net 5 hours, over 5 hours to consume that meal. And on that small net, 6.5 hours. A huge increase, double the amount of time to eat the same amount of hay. Now this is important, and this ties into non-structural carbohydrate intake again, because we're increasing that time to consumption. We're spreading out that ingestion of non-structural carbohydrates. And also because when we look at horse grazing behavior, horses evolved to graze throughout the day. Okay, horses in the wild, they've done many studies on this. If horses have the opportunity to graze throughout the day, they typically like to graze somewhere around 16 hours. Now, when we put humans into the mix and when we're stalling horses and we're only feeding them 2 meals a day, you can imagine if we're feeding them hay on the ground or in that commercially available feed net, they're only eating about 6 hours a day. That's a lot of time throughout the day where horses don't have any ingestion of food or fiber into their gastrointestinal tract, which can create issues in itself, behavioral issues. It can create physiological issues as well. So by using some of these slow feed hay nets, we're seeing a closer time. We're mimicking that natural grazing time a little bit better. Okay, so horses can perhaps graze out of that medium net for about 10 hours a day. Out of that small net, we're closer to 13 hours. So again, that's overall just a more healthy approach for that horse's GI tract for their overall digestive intake. When we look at how much was wasted, so this is also, how can it affect our bottom dollar? How can it affect our pocket? We saw, and this wasn't necessarily something we were evaluating in the project, but we did this afterwards. We did see an increase in waste from that control, which is not surprising, right? I mean, we would expect that when hay is on the ground, horses can move it around, they might defecate on it, they might lay on it, compared to when we have those slower feed hay nets, where typically they're not able to get much around their stall at all. And I can tell you, I had a bunch of undergrad students working for me on this project. They all fought to go clean up the stalls after the medium net and small net feeders versus after that control, because the hay was so much easier to just sweep up and put in a bucket to weigh. So then we did another follow-up study because we said, okay, it increases time to consumption. How does this affect metabolism? How is this going to affect that horse's overall health? So we used the hay nets again. We used the medium net this time, and then we fed hay on the floor. And we evaluated how that affected their glucose peaks, how it affected horses' insulin, and also, as I'll show you on the next slide, how it affected cortisol. I think I included that in here. And so we have on this upper graph in the left-hand corner, we have net day 1, so their glucose on that first initial part of this study. And I should also mention this was technically a weight loss study. So we wanted to see, can we feed smaller amounts of hay during the day, and using the nets, will it increase that time to consumption and not have negative implications on overall health? And so what we can see when we compare this net glucose, this graph, we have days 1, day 14, day 28, that was the duration of this trial, and then we have horses that were fed on the floor. You can notice the horses that were fed on that floor had a huge rise in glucose, okay, right about 3.5 hours post-feeding, much higher than we would see with the horses that were fed using that net. With that concurrent, with that increase in glucose, again, when we look at that graph right above it, those horses that were fed hay on the floor, they also had a larger peak for insulin. And again, insulin is implicated and glucose is implicated in a lot of these different diseases that we're seeing in these horses. So the nets actually did have a positive impact on those metabolic hormones. I hope I included it in here. I did. Okay. And so then we also wanted to see, well, what does this do to that stress hormone? Okay. And again, cortisol is involved with a couple of these other diseases as well, with that equine metabolic syndrome in particular, with obesity, a lot of different things. What we see from this graph is that the horses that were fed on the net had a really tight cortisol level. It didn't really change a whole lot. Okay. And these are hours post-feeding. So we fed twice a day. And you can see hour 0 was taken right before feeding, okay, and then it kind of goes, and again, we fed right there around hour 12, in the evening. So we don't see a whole lot of a change in the cortisol levels of those horses that were fed using that hay net. But look what happens to the horses that were fed on the floor. Okay, it's all over the place. Especially on day 1 in that darker line, they were really elevated. And what was interesting is that we found that horses that were fed on the floor finished much quicker, okay, they were done eating much quicker than horses that were fed on the net. And these horses were kept in a barn so they could see each other, they could see their buddies still eating, and that caused an increase in their cortisol levels as well. Okay, so they were going long periods of time without having any sort of forage to chew on, and they were seeing their buddies that were still eating, so we saw increases in that stress hormone there. So with some really cool stuff that we found, overall, basically, we're seeing that these hay nets really do have positive impact, particularly if we have stalled horses that don't get outside, they aren't getting forage throughout the day. This could be a really great way to decrease that overall non-structural carbohydrate content, decrease cortisol production, and improve their overall health. What about on pasture? Okay, how can we ever limit their intake on pasture? Well, one of the biggest things that I get from people is that they want to limit the amount of time that horses spend on pasture. If they only turn them out for a couple hours a day, then typically their horse isn't going to get to eat a whole lot. Well, I did a study in North Carolina State, and we found that that's not necessarily true. So what we did is we turned horses out for 3 hours a day, and they got supplemental hay in the afternoon. We turned them out in the morning. Turned them out for 6 hours in the morning, fed them supplemental hay at night. Then we turned horses out for 9 hours. They didn't get any supplemental hay, or they were on continuous turnout. And we measured how much they were consuming per hour. And what this graph is showing you is that their pasture dry matter intake rate, so how much they were consuming per hour, was significantly increased at that 3 hours and even that 6 hours compared to particularly that 24 hours. And this was a follow-up study to another study that was done right before I got there, where they had horses that were turned out for 8 hours every day. And what they did was they measured the intake during the first 4 hours of turnout compared to the second 4 hours of turnout. And what they found is that horses that were turned out in that first 4 hours ate a lot more than they did in that second 4 hours. Okay? So when we turn horses out for only a couple hours, especially if it's consistently only for a couple of hours, horses know that they're only going to get out for a little bit. So they put their head to the ground and they don't come up for air until we force them off. They're eating more bites per second. They're grabbing as much forage as they possibly can. We're not necessarily limiting their forage intake significantly by doing that. We've actually been able to come up with an equation to kind of estimate how much they're consuming at pasture. And this equation was developed by my advisor at North Carolina State, taking data from several different pasture research publications. And it's a really cool, it's a really cool equation because we can use how many hours of turnout and how much our horse weighs to determine how much they might be consuming. So the equation is just y equals 5.12 times the square root of x minus 2.86. X is just how many hours of turnout you're going to turn them out for. And Y is your grams of dry matter consumed divided by kilograms of body weight. So if, say, we were turning them out for only 4 hours, okay, you would plug that 4 into that square root of x part, and you would get 7.38 grams of dry matter per kilogram of body weight. Now, you have to multiply that by however much your horse weighs in kilograms to get your total amount that they are consuming. So if your horse weighs 500 kilograms, you would take that number, multiply that by 500, and you would get, I'm doing this as we go, about 3,690 grams. So you would divide that by 1,000 to get that into kilos, and multiply by 2.2 to get to pounds. In 4 hours, that 500 kilogram horse is consuming 8 pounds. Okay? When we're talking about how much that horse needs to consume per day, we're only talking 22 pounds. It's eating 8 pounds in only 4 hours. So it's eating almost half of its requirement in a very short period of time. So again, restricting pasture turnout is not necessarily the best method. And if we're trying to limit non-structural carbohydrates, it can actually set us out for problems because that horse is ingesting grass so rapidly that if it has elevated non-structural carbohydrates, it's ingesting that non-structural carbohydrate very rapidly too. So one other thing that people do is use a grazing muzzle. Okay, and this was a study, again, I did this at University of Minnesota. There had only ever been one other study evaluating how effective a grazing muzzle is at decreasing intake. And this was done in the UK, and the way they measured it, they basically backtracked, and they estimated intake of these ponies by measuring their feces and measuring the content of energy and different things like that in their feces to estimate how much they consumed. So what we did is we directly measured in the pasture how much that horse was consuming. So we had 4 different species that we were testing. We established plots with Kentucky bluegrass, and that, if you've seen Kentucky bluegrass, which I'm sure you have, it's a pretty popular lawn grass. It grows prostrate or along the ground, and it's very fine. We grew meadow fescue, which grows upright, highly preferred. Horses really like to eat meadow fescue and Kentucky bluegrass. Reed canary grass grows upright. It's very coarse. Horses really don't like it. And then perennial ryegrass also grows low to the ground, very fine, but horses don't like it as much as Kentucky bluegrass. And those ratings, those rankings were determined from a previous study that we'd done. So what we did is we had horses assigned to these treatments, and each horse was assigned, they got to see each of these different types of grasses, and they had one day on one particular species with or without a grazing muzzle, and the next day was the opposite then. And we saw how much that grazing muzzle can really affect their intake. And what we found, Kentucky bluegrass, 38% reduction with the muzzle, meadow fescue, 30%, perennial ryegrass, 45%. That reed canary grass had only a 4% reduction. Now, when you look at that, you might kind of scratch your head and wonder what was going on. I can tell you, in this first year of this project, we turned those horses out onto those reed canary plots, and with a muzzle or without, they just stood there and they waited until they got taken off those plots. They did not like the reed canary grass. They knew that if they just waited until the afternoon, they were going to get fed some yummy hay. So they just chose not to eat. So even without a grazing muzzle on, they weren't really eating it at all. That's why we don't see that major difference. But when we averaged all these reductions, we got about a 30%, about 29% reduction in intake. So we did a second year study on this. But unfortunately, our meadow fescue and our perennial ryegrass all winter killed. So we were only left with Kentucky bluegrass and reed canary grass. It worked out well because they were complete opposite ends of the spectrum, highly preferred and not preferred, and tall growing versus prostrate growing. But again, what we found was that, of course, we forced them to eat the reed canary grass. They learned that it was going to be a long time until they got hay. We still saw about a 30% reduction. So based on these numbers, we estimate the grazing muzzles are really only going to decrease intake by about 30%. That's still significant. It's still a great tool to have, but maybe not as much as we had previously thought grazing muzzles would decrease. The question here is, do grazing muzzles cause stress? And if so, could the stress of a grazing muzzle spike cortisol? That is a great question. We did not evaluate it. What we did do is we sat out there with the horses and kind of just visually estimated how stressed out the horses were. And with the exception to one horse that was kind of the boss mare and did what she wanted when she wanted. We did not notice any visible signs of stress. That would be a great follow-up, and I do think that actually I think University of Kentucky or Virginia State might have actually just done that. So look for those results here soon. I think I just saw it published for one of our conferences that's coming up. Because obviously, again, yeah, if it decreases intake, but it's increasing cortisol, that could have some negative impacts on that horse. Another question, does the size or number of holes in the grazing muzzle affect the intake? Yes and no. I definitely do think that certain grazing muzzles are going to be better at limiting intake than others. The one we used was one that we saw most commonly used by horse barns, and it just has it's that basket weave with that solid bottom with the single opening. And some of the horses actually got pretty smart because it had that basket weave. They learned that if they turned their head to the side, they could get some grass up through the side that they could eat kind of out of the side of their mouth versus just that small hole in the bottom. But again, even with that, we still didn't see a change in that percent reduction. So I would play around. Some muzzles are designed to have less of a restricted intake for those horses. Some are designed to have more. So it's kind of going with what you need for your horse and what do you think is going to work better. And obviously watch the horses. Just because your horse, constantly every day is able to get that grazing muzzle off doesn't necessarily mean that it's stressed. What it probably means is that it's annoyed and it wants to eat as much as possible. And we had that issue happen quite a bit. Yes, so there's a comment here. I use a grazing muzzle and the horse is much happier being out with the other horses. I absolutely agree. Horses are social animals and they like being around their buddies. So if you have the option of putting a grazing muzzle on and letting them out on pasture for a little bit versus keeping them in a dry lot while all their other buddies are at pasture, they're probably going to be a little bit happier with the rest of their buddies out there. Absolutely. So that was kind of all that I had for this. I hope that I gave you a couple different things to think about when you're trying to determine, is my horse at risk for having elevated non-structural carbohydrate intake? Is it at risk for some of these diseases that are caused by that? And what are some ways to manage it? Here's a question here. I need to soak my hay due to respiratory issues to compensate for the nutritional loss. I soak half of the hay daily for 5 to 10 minutes and the other half of the hay daily for 6 hours. How might this affect the NSC over the course of a day? So if you're soaking half of the hay for only a short period of time, for 5 to 10 minutes, you're not going to have a major decrease in that non-structural carbohydrate compared to the rest that you're soaking for 6 hours. And what I would recommend doing, the University of Minnesota actually did a hay soaking study where they evaluated different lengths of time that they were soaking that hay and the impacts on different nutritional parameters. And I highly recommend looking that up. It would be a great answer because they looked at way different times, I think all the way up to 9 hours of soaking. Some things aren't going to be affected, such as your crude protein, because that's not water soluble. Obviously, non-structural carbohydrates are going to be affected. Some of your minerals are going to be affected too. So definitely look into that, and I think that would help you out quite a bit. Question is, what is a safe level of non-structural carbohydrate for a horse without any of the risk factors noted, specifically in regard to making grain decisions? So if your horse doesn't have laminitis issues, then I think really what you need to be worried about more is kind of acclimation. If you remember, I gave numbers that 3 grams of starch per kilogram of body weight. That is what I would stick to. I would try to calculate that out. Of course, I can help you with that. Jennifer could help you with that. That's kind of the maximum amount that we want to see any regular horse have, is that 3 grams per kilogram. Are there any other questions? Well, if not, feel free to contact me anytime. My number and my email is available online. Oh, we might have one more coming in here. I'm always open and happy to answer any questions that you guys may have. Thank you all so much.